In the Bronze Age, you have the first example of a material that travelled all the way from one sea to the other. It must have been precious, it must have been lightweight, it must have been precious in relation to its weight. And indeed it was. That substance is amber.
Legend tells us a river of tears flowed at the beginning of time into the sea, turning to amber. The clear tears of the innocent, and the dark red tainted by the evil and corrupt. It's the sap of fossilized pine forests. They grew when this sea was dry land and glaciers filled the valleys.
Supplies of copper and tin moved northwards and southwards to balance that trade. First of all came amber, and later on all the other forest products.
The daily farming life of the community was bound by a network of sharing and obligation. Milk, grain and labour went back and forth. In the give and take, the elites offered social organisation and protection. Both safety and danger came from the armed warrior chief. Communities expanded their farmlands and knowledge under the faint shadow of violence. These farmers were now able to grow a breed of sheep which offered a touch of luxury. The fleece was different. The open, straight fibres of earlier breeds were now curly and dense. It is the wool we know today. To use it, they developed the gentle craft of spinning. Clothing could now be much warmer for this northern climate. Customers wanted status, so spinners turned to the expert colour dyers. They extracted their dyes from plants in the forest. These people were healers, whose knowledge of remedies was the beginning of medicine. The new soft wools were spun into luxury clothing. Beyond the family, they could only be afforded by the wealthy. The clothes were so loved, people wore them into the next world. They were buried as individuals and took with them the symbols of their own identity, their clothes and ornaments. In these magnificent burials, discovered in Denmark, the dead were placed in oak coffins hacked from whole tree trunks.
Some of the most spectacular individual burials that we know come from the Bronze Age. We have a sudden window on what life was like in Bronze Age Europe 4 millennia ago. And we see people buried in woolen clothing. It's brown wool, it's very simple, in many ways it's rustic, but it's the height of sophistication, and probably only they, as the leaders, could afford to be dressed entirely in woolen clothes. And And you see for the first time, in a way that we can only imagine in other circumstances, what these people looked like and how they might have acted. And we see some specific human motivations, for there is the chief buried with his long wooden scabbard, and poking out of it the top of a metal weapon. And you pull it out, and it's not the sword that you expected, it's a little dagger. And he's been buried there with the appropriate piece of weaponry, but his family must have known it was only a little dagger.
The coffin was placed on stones above the ground. These funerals of the powerful were elaborate ceremonies. Later, a great mound of earth would be built as a tomb. It was there in memory of a person whose name was expected to live on. Right across northern Europe, archaeologists have discovered ceremonial pools. Many are guarded by mother goddess figures, important to the first farmers. From the beginning of human habitation, people have made offerings. Now the warriors added thousands of new objects. Some of them show us they were seeing their spirit world in a new way. Nature, too, was an expression of power. The sun god rose each day, drawn proudly across the sky by the horse. Across the Middle East, the chariots of the Hittites and Egyptians brought warriors and kings. The story of the first farmers ends with armies and the rise of the first cities. And in Europe, we see the first recorded images of violence. The farmers were running out of available land. There is evidence of boundary fences. Stockaded villages were beginning to appear. The last hunter-gatherers collided with the warriors. Their way of life disappeared forever. And then, around 3,000 years ago, there was a dramatic increase in the use of metals. The smiths discovered iron, which swept Europe. It revolutionized farming with cheap, effective tools. And it gave rise to great Iron Age civilizations. It loosed the sword and the soldier on the world.